Welcome everyone to this third session.
Bienvenue tout le monde à la troisième session des 50 esprits
from UNESCO, and I will be the moderator for an interesting exchange for the next 2 hours. We are gathered together for this event because it is the 50th anniversary of UNESCO's World Heritage Convention. And today is the third session of our series of 50 Minds for the Next 50. And the focus today is on heritage in the post-COVID world. So appropriately, we are going to have authorities and luminaries and brilliant thinkers who are experts in modern medicine, who are creatives, who are writers, and they are going to discuss resilience in the face of that global pandemic. And on this note, it is my pleasure to introduce the Assistant Director General for Culture here at UNESCO, Mr. Ernesto Ottone, who can tell us a bit more about this series of 50 Minds for the Next 50. Over to you, Mr. Ottone.
Thank you, Rochelle. So welcome to all. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the third session of UNESCO's 50 Minds for the Next 50. This roundtable, as it was mentioned, is part of the 50th anniversary commemoration of the World Heritage Convention. What started out as an innovative mechanism 5 decades ago has matured into a global recognized emblem, synonymous to outstanding natural and cultural heritage of humanity. The convention has transformed how we conserve, protect, and promote heritage, as well as enticed the public to appreciate these truly unique places near and far. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the heritage sector came to a grinding halt. At the heat of the pandemic, nearly 90% of countries with World Heritage properties had totally or partially closed. In 2020, World Heritage sites experienced 157 days of closure on average. Among World Heritage sites that change entrance fee, their income half on average. This has dealt a heavy financial blow to these sites, impacting their ability to maintain conservation work. But the impact of pandemic far extended financial consequences to communities who look to such places as part of their cultural life. The crisis has meant a disruption to their communication, to their communal identity. Many intangible cultural heritage practices connected to World Heritage have also been interrupted, with important social, economic, and cultural consequences on communities around the world. At the same time, we have witnessed the unique role that creativity and heritage play for our well-being. During lockdowns, we found solace and resilience in music, film, literature, dance, and also museums and sites. Diverse cultural expression of who we are as individuals, but also as community. In other words, the pandemic has brought to light the inextricable link between health and heritage. As the world continues to reel from COVID-19, the question we must ask ourselves is, what did we learn and where do we go from here? I can think of no better way to explore the future of health and heritage than today's esteemed panel. We have among us epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, public health researcher, and historian of medicine. We also welcome political leaders, activists, and artists who have shown leadership and creativity in the face of COVID-19. The diverse group of people reflects UNESCO commitment to a more inclusive vision of the next 50 years of World Heritage and heritage at large. On this note, it is my pleasure to kickstart the third session of the 50 Minds for the Next 50, titled Heritage in the Post-COVID World. Rochelle, I give you the floor back, and thank you to all to participate in these meaningful meetings.
Thank you very much to UNESCO Assistant Director General for Culture, Ernesto Ottone, for giving us the context of today's discussion. This is going to be a really dynamic, interesting, rich exchange, and it's going to base itself on 50 Minds for the Next 50 with dialogues of 2 people on our panel each time. So we're going to have 5 of these dialogues. And I want to alert our audience that if they would like to listen to English or French, we have simultaneous translation. So I would like to quickly introduce the short video. Yes, so we're going to start with a very quick video, and then I will come to our first dialogue. Thank you. Okay, so our first dialogue will be for 20 minutes, and I would like to introduce Dr. Adi Utarini and Professor Frank Snowden. So Dr. Adi Utarini is an Indonesian public health researcher and a professor of public health at Gajah Mada University. As an internationally established researcher, she has greatly contributed to public health in Indonesia. Her field of expertise is particularly focused on disease control of dengue fever. She has also been named one of Time's 100 most influential people in 2021. And she will be in a great discussion with Professor Frank Snowden. He is a historian and Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine at Yale University. He specializes in the comparative history of epidemic diseases. And in 2019, he published the book Epidemics and Society from the Black Death to the Present, which focuses on the history of public health, the impact of emerging and resurgent diseases, and issues of medical ethics. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two discussants and ask Professor Snowden to perhaps kick it off by asking the first question to Dr. Adi Utarini, and then you can build on each other's replies and have more questions back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to have this opportunity. So thank you very much. And I would love to kick off our session by asking Adi a very important question, which has to do with the relationship between culture and our health. That is to say, during the pandemic of COVID-19, people have argued that the relationship between culture and well-being has been clearly demonstrated. And I'm just wondering if I could ask you, having witnessed this period, if you do indeed see a change in the relationship of culture and health, and how this is likely to play out in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. This is a wonderful opportunity to share and also to have a dialogue with you and with everyone. The time of pandemic really is extraordinary for human beings to discover this relationship between culture. And I think also to make even a stronger case for how culture and religion affected our health. I live in Indonesia, in the city of Yogyakarta, with a very strong cultural heritage, and happen to be very close to one of the World Heritage, Borobudur. And the place where I live and this country has a very strong belief and practice of, we call it gotong royong, or community service to provide mutual help to others. Now, COVID-19 give us lessons in both directions that on one hand, we realize that to be healthy, we need to create a healthy community surrounding us. And during this era, I've never seen where communities built their pride in such a way that all problems they faced during the pandemic, they were able to set up groups that were able to find very effective solutions very quickly. Now, of course, on the other hand, in the beginning of the pandemic, because of safety and health, this sort of limits all the cultural activities and cultural values where in a place where gathering of the people is really embedded in the culture. But even so, I think with the cultural capital, I think we witness creativity and strong social cultural bond, enabling the people to find a way to still preserve the culture and safety at the same time. So I think it's certainly very, very unique, and there was a dynamic into how this culture is associated to health. And Frank, maybe talking about heritage in post-pandemic situation, also given your expertise throughout history, how do you think have pandemics and epidemics affected the built and natural heritage?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your reflections as well on the experience that you witnessed. It seems to me that a very important mistake to avoid is to think that pandemics are all the same, and that in the past they have all yielded predictable results in terms of heritage and culture. And just very quickly, one could say, for example, that they have rather a spectrum, and each one is different and has its own individual place on that spectrum. At one end, we could say, for example, that the Spanish influenza actually has had relatively, despite its enormous legacy of death and suffering, had a tremendously small impact on culture and the arts. It's often called the forgotten pandemic. There are few sites of memory recording that. There has been relatively small production of literature as a result. And it's also true that the history of the pandemic really only got underway at the 100th anniversary of that. And so that's one extreme. At the other extreme, one could say that the Black Death and cholera had a tremendous influence on religion, on the arts, on culture, and indeed, if one takes cholera, on the built environment in terms of cities, because cities across Europe were either retrofitted to make them immune, if you like, in a sense, to a return of cholera, or actually consciously rebuilt. For example, Paris was rebuilt in order to make itself in part so that cholera would not return. The city of Naples was consciously rebuilt for that very same purpose. And so one sees this tremendous range of possibilities, and it seems to me this provides a great opportunity for UNESCO and World Heritage, perhaps to intervene to make a difference in perhaps a way that is innovative, that is to say, to have to provide the role of stimulation for thinking about these issues. I like to imagine what an experience it would be to create a site of memory where the memories of people during this terrible pandemic were recorded and preserved and available, where there would be conferences and exhibits on the role of science in perhaps tracing, for example, the development of vaccines, where there would be discussions of the impact on geography, of also preserving the memory, as you say, of initiatives of resilience. And that could be at the level of intellectuals in part. For example, there had been enormous creativity in places like Paris around the 30-minute city as a place that cities are on the front line of zoonotic diseases in the future. And so cities need to be reclaimed from the automobile and from pollution, which plays such an enormous role in creating favorable conditions for these diseases. And that is one example of resilience. Another is places of informal settlements in places like Lagos, where people realized that the kinds of advice being offered from metropolitan centers actually did not work. Social distancing was impossible to practice. Hand washing was impossible to practice. And so people came together to find new ways of understanding their relationship to the built environment and promote that. So this would not be simply a museum to disaster and gloom. That is part of the pandemic experience, but it's also to provide hopefulness, what people can do, the creative role of science, and also warnings about the misuse of science. There could be about the role of the environmental crisis. I think culture also means we need to have more scientific literacy among the general population. And so I like to imagine perhaps a site of memory in a place like Cairo, for example, where this would all come together and there would be a site of memory stimulating the arts, remembering people's experiences, learning from this experience to avoid a repetition in the future. And I think that UNESCO could intervene in a very powerful way in the present to preserve this experience that is still with us and ongoing, and that we really need to understand if we're not to live through it again. That would be one hope that I would certainly have.
Yeah. And with that, talking about the memory, I'm sure education would be then a very important effort to carry over, because for example, I could also think about building case studies. We're proposing to strengthen also global education, because now with the pandemics, with the digitalization in many aspects of life, this could also be transferred and delivered to different levels of education, where, just as you said, Frank, to make sure that within this memory that we could really stimulate global learning. And I think the cross-cultural approaches would be an interesting point also, because this is one of the strong point in my view when we learn from the pandemic.
Absolutely. I think you're quite right. And I'm glad to hear you stress the interdisciplinarity of this experience. I think this is too important. Simply, it is a scientific and medical issue, public health, but we also need to have the involvement of anthropologists, of our artists, who provide us with the lexicon and the image to digest and understand. I think that relates heavily to one of the long-term legacies, which is our mental health, that we're not thinking only about our physical health, but I think one of the most powerful impacts of COVID-19 is on anxiety, depression, these sorts of mental, psychological problems. And I think that a site of memory of this kind and demonstrating what people have done, that we aren't powerless. We actually control our own destiny if we wish to accept that responsibility. I think that's terribly important. And I wanted to, if I could, on the same theme in a way, to ask how you think that interdisciplinary collaboration might be something that UNESCO could actually foster and promote. That is, bringing together dialogue between scientists, historians, artistic artists, and many anthropologists. How could naturalists and environmentalists, what do you think UNESCO could do to further that aspect that's so important in our cultural legacy?
Yeah. I think for personally for me, I mean, this is also a new area of interest, with very concrete cases, very tangible, that multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach is really needed, is even an urgency to do. I have never also experienced that this could be such a very close link between heritage and health. I mean, talking about culture and health, perhaps this is a broader conversation, but thinking specifically on heritage, I think these are plenty opportunities to explore many perhaps unknown phenomenon, and also potential interventions that perhaps in the past this is not yet done in a similar way. So I think there should be, I would say it should be in terms of research and education. The potentials are great, and just thinking about going ahead, perhaps UNESCO could trigger some kind of a strategic research areas in these areas, heritage and health. And within this, I think it could attract many researchers from many different expertises to come closer together. And I think research is always also in line with education, and this is where we could strengthen and where we could move closer to each other, I would say, Frank. This is, for me, this is also an area, a new area, but that's why it's so interesting.
Absolutely. I think it's, in many ways, it's not just a gloomy time, but an exciting one that could have lots of positive contributions to the future in that way. I wonder if you also have perhaps thoughts about perhaps narrowing the gap between, say, UNESCO and the World Health Organization, that perhaps there is a great place for fruitful dialogue between the two, especially if one thinks, for example, that Dr. Tedros was talking so much about disinformation and misinformation and their terrible impact upon this pandemic. And that would seem, would you agree, to highlight the importance of education and raising the level of scientific awareness, of cultural awareness, and indeed of the fact that we're all in this together. This pandemic has clearly shown that national boundaries have no place in an effective plan to combat a world pandemic.
Yes, I fully agree. I fully agree with you, Frank. I also can imagine that, for example, the community surrounding the heritage stage, I mean, they are the ones who can really be empowered on the risk, on the health issues, safety issues. And I think there needs to be a more integrated system, with the health system, because where the heritage sites, these are potential places for people to gather from many different parts of the world, and also for the community to preserve the culture that they have. So I agree very much that UNESCO and WHO should work closer together to bridge and integrate many different aspects.
Frank and Adi, thank you. I want to just jump in because we have about 2 minutes left. So maybe we could go back to Frank for any last thought, reaction, and just have a last word, because we'll wrap up in about a minute or two. It's been great so far. Thanks.
Thank you. No, I think very much that we have been having this conversation in a way that I think shows the relationship between two very different perspectives of natural science and history. And that's just part of the model that needs to be, I think, taken forward, a lesson to be learned from this pandemic, that this is a multifaceted and therefore multidisciplinary problem that needs to be faced. And I think I have a vision, I think we're sort of talking, Adi, you and I, about what in one way might be expressed, I don't mean actually in institutional terms, but we might think of this vision of something like a global ministry of innovation and innovative ideas with regard to heritage and its relationship to health, and how we can avoid another pandemic experience. That would be my hope for the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Adi and Frank. It's really been interesting. First, great dialogue, something optimistic too to come out of COVID, so that we've thought about what is energizing us and how we can be interdisciplinary and unite different communities globally, no more borders. So thank you. I'm going to move right along onto our next panel discussion. And I would like to introduce Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa and Mr. Salim Abdool Karim. So Maria Fernanda Espinosa is an Ecuadorian academic, politician, and a diplomat. She was the first woman from Latin America and the Caribbean to serve as the president of the United Nations General Assembly. She has decades of experience in international affairs, security, sustainable development, and environment protection. She is also deeply committed to promoting gender equality and the full participation of women in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And she is a Goodwill Ambassador of the Latin American and Caribbean Fund for the Development of the Indigenous Peoples. And she will be discussing today with Dr. Salim Abdool Karim. He is a South African epidemiologist and professor of global health at Columbia University in New York. He is also director of the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa, and is known for his contribution to HIV prevention and treatment. He is also an inventor of patents used for HIV vaccine candidates and antibody-based passive immunization strategies. Dr. Karim, during the pandemic, also served as the chair of the South African Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19. So turning the discussion, which will be again, questions, answers, reactions, reflections, over to the two of you, let's start by handing the microphone over to Dr. Karim and see what he would like to first ask to Ms. Espinosa. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm particularly pleased to be here with Ms. Espinosa. So if I can kick off, Maria, if that's fine with you, just, I think as we've been grappling with COVID, we understand that part of our future in this post-COVID vision that we have is the importance of biodiversity, its importance of our heritage and where we're coming from, and our indigenous cultures. Your thoughts on, how has the pandemic impacted biodiversity, indigenous culture, and heritage?
Well, thank you, Salim. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And it's such a treat to have this exchange. Our paths already crossed at the Lancet Commission on COVID-19. And today, thanks to UNESCO and its very creative initiative, 50 Minds for the Next 50 on heritage and post-COVID. We are here. We are here with all of you, with these brilliant minds of around the world. Thank you, Rochelle, and to my dear friend Ernesto Ottone for having us, for bringing us together. So, responding to your question, Salim, I think that if you look at indigenous peoples from around the world, it is clear that the COVID-19 pandemic became and still is an existential threat to indigenous communities, not only to their health and in their livelihoods, but also to their life-supporting ecosystems, their traditional knowledge, their cultural heritage. And here we understand very well that heritage is not only about the built heritage, but about knowledge systems, about community and collective cultural legacies. So it is, if you look at the numbers, indigenous peoples have had the highest COVID mortality rates. For example, in the United States, the highest numbers correspond indeed to First Nations, to African Americans, to the Latino community. So, and this is due to access to vaccines, to healthcare, but also to reluctance to be vaccinated. So what we witness, and I think it's important for our reflection today, is that transactional inequalities are key to understand the pandemic variables. Poverty, exclusion, racism, sexism translate into higher vulnerability and higher mortality. So this was a lesson that we learned with COVID-19. And if we consider that indigenous communities were already impacted by pre-existing marginalization, structural inequalities, systemic racism, what we see is that government measures came too late or were insufficient to tackle socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic. And I think that your question about biodiversity, it is, I think the depletion of biodiversity because of ongoing destruction of the ecosystems that they depend upon, it's a pre-COVID structural situation, but that was magnified with the pandemic in a way. So we know indigenous peoples living remotely or even in voluntary isolation suffered more. And this is also because, and you know better, Salim, because you're an epidemiologist, because of the lack of immunity to many of the infectious diseases of so-called the West. In the Amazon region, where I come from, it is estimated that up to 78 indigenous communities live in isolation. So this, if you connect this to encroachment of their lands by illegal loggers, mining, et cetera, that of course boosted contagion threats for these communities. And so in terms of culture, this is very much connected. Culture, biodiversity, indigenous people's lifestyles, they were really disrupted by the pandemic. Often we see indigenous people's cultures and lifestyles as the foundation of their resilience and social cohesion. And suddenly with the COVID-19, they were prohibited to gather and mark special events, harvests, coming of age ceremonies, and other community activities. So basically, I think that all these aspects really undermined or disrupted their local culture. And I think if we speak about heritage, the built and immaterial heritage from the Amazon to Siberia, the loss of elders due to COVID-19 was profoundly painful, given, of course, their wisdom and status as cultural knowledge and language bearers. So we know that, unfortunately, the pandemic killed many tribal elders in the Peruvian Amazon, in Russian Siberia, in the Australian outback. And that, of course, also affects gravely languages, because some of them were last speakers of endangered indigenous languages. So I think that the general assessment is not promising. What was promising, and I would end with that, Salim, is that the creative manners in which indigenous communities organize themselves because of the lack of government attention, through their own community service providing. Women had a very important role to play in organizing, food supply systems, cooperation and solidarity mechanisms to access to Western medicine, but also a fostering of traditional medicine. I know firsthand, for example, COICA, the Confederation of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon, of the 8 countries of the Amazon, they got together to gather data, to exchange good practices. They did their own program, which was a transboundary 8-country program to protect themselves and to learn from each other. So this is the spark of hope of what we learned in this pandemic. And we also learn how connected, culture, heritage, indigenous collective rights and inequalities are connected. So in this equation, Salim, I would ask, how can knowledge, traditions, structures of communities be better used to respond to these global crises, including climate, not only pandemics? So I give back the floor to you, dear Salim.
Thanks very much, Maria. I think you've very nicely captured what has been quite a central theme of trying to understand the full ramifications of this pandemic, and that is the sharp way in which inequality has been spotlighted by COVID-19, and the way in which the vulnerable have yet again been those that have had to deal with many of the harmful effects of the pandemic. Let me just touch on, in relation to the question you asked, which is quite pertinent, because when we think about responding to a new threat, in this case, it was early 2020, we're dealing with a new virus in the form of SARS-CoV-2, a novel coronavirus. When we look at which countries did really well initially, they were mainly countries that in Southeast Asia that built on their strong traditions, that in the event that an individual became ill with a respiratory condition, they would wear a mask. Mask wearing is not something new to many of those cultures. And the mask wearing is fundamentally about protecting others. That when a person got ill, the person wore a mask so that that person wouldn't infect others, whether it's in public transport or whether it's in just walking down the street. That, for me, is a critically important issue that we haven't really grasped the value of cultures, the way in which our traditions and our knowledge have focused us to protect others, not just this kind of, me first, this kind of narcissism that we seem to be promoting in many of our cultures, but it's really about the culture and about the tradition of caring for others. Now, in Africa, we have a word for it. We call it Ubuntu. U-B-U-N-T-U, Ubuntu, made famous by our first democratic president in South Africa, Nelson Mandela. When he invoked this tradition, Ubuntu simply means I am because you are. So it's elementary that I exist not as an island. I exist not in a vacuum. I exist because you exist. And that fundamental tradition of African culture is one that needed to be invoked in a way that brought forward the way in which we needed to deal with COVID-19. That I am safe when you are safe. You are safe when I am safe. It is our fundamental mutual interdependence that we build strongly into our traditions. So I think when we think about that and how that has been used, perhaps share with us some of your insights about, how knowledge of indigenous peoples and how that has been used to safeguard heritage during this global crisis that we've been dealing with.
Well, Salim, I cannot agree more with you. And I think that, first of all, we should keep in mind that it is likely, very likely, I would say, that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. And what does it means that it's, as a poet, I'm saying this, but it is the way of nature, to speak to us, to humanity, and tell us that we are trespassing planetary boundaries in a way, because zoonotic diseases are disruptions in the natural environment, because what humans are doing to planet Earth. And when we look at in general, indigenous people's lifestyles, and it's not that I read that in books. I lived and worked in the Ecuadorian Amazon for several years, and I can tell you, that there is an incredible knowledge of thousands of years to understand that nature is not something that is outside, of human life, that is part of the Earth system. And since we are part of the Earth system, we have to take care of our home in a way. And I think it's the main, starting point. We all know that indigenous peoples hold a very rich diversity of cultures, of languages, of living heritage. You mentioned the knowledge, the representations, the expressions, the skills that remain so relevant in the 21st century. Their knowledge about biodiversity, about traditional medicine that was deployed during the COVID-19 pandemic. I had the privilege to take part of some of the exchanges between COICA, the Fund for Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, when they were putting together this observatory, sharing good practices from communities, sharing knowledge, and sharing their experiences of resilience. And I think that you were so right when you brought the very concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are. This sense of solidarity, of collective action, I think it's a great teaching for Western societies. And unfortunately, we witness very much selfish behaviors, vaccine hoarding at one time, extreme nationalism, even though we knew that, no one was safe until everybody was safe. And until this very day, we are experiencing a big gap on access to vaccines, on access to health services. Unfortunately, people continue to die. Indigenous peoples, rural communities that are far away from health services, they continue to die. And it is true, as we have mentioned here, Salim, COVID-19 showed us the greater vulnerability of a divided society. And I believe the best indigenous knowledge to safeguard heritage in times of global crisis is promoting precisely the sense of community and traditional governance systems reinforce community, the ability to respond collectively, to build resilience, which is exactly what we need in the troubled times that we're currently experiencing. And just speaking to you, a great scientist, I would ask you, Salim, how can collaboration, these bridges between science, culture, heritage, be fostered and accelerated, especially in the region of the world where you come from, Africa? And if you allow me a footnote, I was really positively impressed by the sense of collective action of the African Union, the response, the collective procurement, the exchange of knowledge, the solidarity that we saw among the African communities and countries. So I'm sure that you have a firsthand experience having been so close to the response team in South Africa.
Yeah, sure, Maria. I'll just give you a brief answer because our time is nearly up. But just to say that we understand as we deal with a crisis like COVID-19, that our ability to stand together is fundamental. And yet, it has also been a time when we have been more divided in the form of new wars in the Ukraine. Just so much about what we are doing is the opposite of what is demanded of us. There is no scenario in this world that sees a handful of countries controlling the pandemic while it is rampantly spreading in others. Every time this virus spreads from one person to another, increases the chance of more mutations, more variants. We, as a world community, have to find our way with our different cultures, with our different societies, the way in which we look at it. And that's what we've been trying to do in Africa, is to stand together under the African Union, under the African CDC. So, for example, when we couldn't buy diagnostic kits because individually we didn't have the buying power, we had to come together to do so. And I believe that's what gave us our strength. That's what enabled us to build that resilience in Africa. I'm just cognizant we have used up our time, but I wanted to just see if Rochelle wanted us to make any last comments.
I wish I could, but you've made such excellent comments already, and we are out of time. It was a quick 20 minutes, but it was very rich. Thank you so much to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, and also thank you so much to Salim Abdool Karim. We really can take away the point of how we have to share how communities, international communities and local communities have to come together if we're going to really grapple with these challenges and overcome them. So we take point on that, and then we move on to our third dialogue. Thank you so much. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Krista Kim and Ahmed Salman. Krista Kim is a Canadian digital artist. She is dedicated to redefining digital technologies in the context of art and humanity. During COVID-19 lockdown, she explored the potential of screens as digital instruments for well-being. And then she created Mars House, which is the first metaverse home for sale as an NFT. And she is also the founder of Techism Movement, which recognizes technology and innovation as an artistic discipline, and she bridges artists and engineers with a drive toward the future. And she's going to be in dialogue with our next thinker, who is Ahmed Salman, an Egyptian senior immunologist and vaccinologist with a research leader at the Gemmer Institute in the University of Oxford. Dr. Salman was part of the research group which helped to develop the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, one of the most widely distributed vaccines administered to more than 170 countries during the COVID crisis. He works to identify, design, and assess new target antigens as vaccine candidates for infectious disease caused by human and veterinary pathogens or cancerous diseases. So this is going to be a really interesting discussion between the two of you for 50 Minds for the next 50. And we're looking again at heritage post-conflict. So to start off, maybe I could already ask to Ahmed to take the floor, take the mic, and kick it off with your first question over to Ms. Kim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really my great pleasure to join you, and thanks for the UNESCO for organizing this amazing initiative. Very glad to be with you, Krista. It's a great opportunity because I think the COVID pandemic was a great chance to show how it is important to combine the real science or the bench science with spreading the knowledge through the network and through the digital network. Having this believe that how it's important vaccines or even making the vaccines without spreading the real knowledge and the correct knowledge through the network and media will result to nothing, because if you made the vaccine and people refuse to take it, or even if you try to make the vaccines and recruit volunteers to do clinical trials without having the proper knowledge and believe in science, will end up to nothing. So believing too much in the value of the network and the technology and the digital networking to spread these kind of knowledge and spreading the awareness is very important. And during the crisis, you showed lots of this groundbreaking digital artwork. And what do you think, how the pandemic impacted your creativity and even your involvement in this kind of knowledge, or spreading this knowledge through your network and using your expertise, which is quite far from like the bench or the science or the infectious disease, but actually it's an important and vital tool to be able to link the real science which is happening between the walls in the labs and simplify that to spread the real knowledge to people.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. It's such an honor to be here with you also, and I'd like to thank UNESCO for organizing this wonderful exchange of ideas with such an esteemed panel. I've heard some incredible interchange, and I have to agree fully with all of the discussions that has preceded ours. My first feedback is that COVID was really an incredible experience, not only because it was a global phenomenon that everyone around the world experienced, but it also was during a time of mass digitization and the rise of Web3. So there are many different movements that were shifting at the same time, different paradigm shifts. For myself, as a meditator, as a person who practices mental health on a daily basis, I'm a transcendental meditation practitioner. I meditate twice per day, and this practice really kept me, well balanced during the pandemic, but it also facilitated my creative abilities. And I believe that, during COVID and experiencing the pandemic, I felt that I needed to escape into the metaverse. So it was really the time when the whole world was becoming more digitized. And my children are both teenagers. So during the pandemic, they would socialize, and they would keep their social touch points, and their mental health and well-being and relationships were upheld through social interaction on digital platforms and games like Roblox or Minecraft. And I learned a lot about the metaverse through watching them and observing them during the lockdowns. And I learned that human consciousness, that friendships can be facilitated and maintained through the metaverse. And as I explored those possibilities further, as an artist, I realized that, in fact, the new frontier of human civilization and heritage is now going into the metaverse, that there are great opportunities. And as an artist, my first experiment was to create a house that is built on the design fundamentals of Zen and wellness. I created a house in the metaverse that I can escape to as my dream home in virtual reality, a space of meditativeness and healing, where the metaverse can become a mechanism of healing through an immersive experience. So that opened a floodgate of ideas that not only has brought me to a situation now where I'm collaborating with scientists, neuroscientists, and engineers on how to bring mental health as an actual clinical study into the metaverse, and bringing that in an affordable manner globally, so that there is basically that it's more accessible and it is global in multiple languages through AI technology. So truly what we see now is the intersection between art, creating experiences that are immersive in the metaverse, and science and engineering and sustainability. All of these can be intersected into the metaverse. I'm actually creating a metaverse with all of these intersections. I'm creating a metaverse that will actually preserve culture. I'm actually going to be collaborating with the royal family of Nelson Mandela. His grandson, Nkosi, Chief Nkosi, has basically commissioned myself and my partner, Peter Martin, for a new metaverse platform called Zero.xyz. We are going to be working on creating a project that will immortalize his legacy. And there are so many leaders in the world whose legacy needs to be immortalized in the metaverse, that the cultural legacy can live on there through education. Now, so just to continue our conversation, Ahmed, you have said that the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated the inequalities among countries, especially in terms of access to vaccines. How has such inequality impacted the resumption of normal life, including cultural activities?
That's absolutely the main issue, and the main lesson that we have to take from this pandemic to be prepared for the next one. The main issue is not the ability to manufacture vaccine or do the science. I think there will be the ability to do that, and even there's more investment happening in this field at the moment, after seeing how such situation of a pandemic or a disease can impact every aspect of our life, not just the health aspects. So it will affect our economy, our social life, our mental health, and everything in our life. So we can easily respond to a next pathogen or pandemic, but the key things is it will be possible to be fair, or the response will be equal to every part of the world. And that's the main issue now. And this is really the heritage that we need to pass through the next generations to be prepared for the next pandemic, to be able to be fair and able to respond in equal manner to any future crisis. Being able to spread this type of knowledge and belief and support to the low income and middle income countries, so then we don't have the same problem in the future. That's a critical thing. So it was possible to make the vaccine in really unprecedented speed, responding quite fast with all the knowledge and the cutting edge technologies in the vaccine or even drug discoveries. And then it was the main issue is distribution and having the supply chain. And this is what we should consider for the next pandemic. They were the hard lesson, although it was like nothing to compare to the COVID during the Ebola. And it's ended up with infecting less than 20,000 person. But that also showed there's no equality and we're not prepared for a pandemic. We still till today have to invest more in this, in the infrastructures, in making easy supply chain, and also using the digital networking to link the different parts of the world, the different scientists, the different manufacturing and legalizing bodies. So then when we move, the whole world move with the same speed. You cannot just be able to produce a drug or a vaccine in one part of the world and then it stay there, and then to move it or distribute it, the virus or the pathogen will be not considering these boundaries, and it will move with the same speed every part of the world. So then you need to also establish a network and infrastructure that can respond in a similar way in every part of the world.
I could jump in there just to also, Ahmed, how do you see that connecting more with culture or heritage, this interconnectedness, the digital, but the whole world coming together and moving forward? Where's the connection with culture in your view?
Yeah, that's an important point. Of course, having the culture that believe, of course, in sharing the resources or sharing the knowledge, that's very important. And we have to be basically prepared for that. Actually, my background was before the pandemic is working on malaria vaccine. And one of the sad parts of this is that you need really to involve all the partners to be able to progress. When there's a problem like malaria just in one part of the world, and there's no massive interest from investing bodies, and it's of course all the logistical difficulties you face to do a research in Africa or deliver things, that make things goes way much slower. Although during the 2020, there were more deaths from malaria than COVID. There were nearly 600,000 deaths from malaria compared to 300,000 deaths from COVID. But still, we cannot push vaccine production and testing and approval and legalizing bodies with the same speed. And of course, investors, because it's in one part of the low-income wards. So the culture is very important, and reducing these differences using, of course, the digital networking, spreading the knowledge, spreading the awareness is that the viruses don't really consider these boundaries. And if it starts in one part of the world, it might easily end up in another part. And that will affect us all. And to be more wise in dealing with such a situation, we have to consider the equality and the fast response equally between the different parts of the world.
Oh, exactly. Thanks. Maybe you have another question for Krista.
Yes, of course. So that's part of it is really the spreading the knowledge, spreading the belief in science, and not just on the level of public, but also a level of investors and decision makers and governments and politicians. And again, having the media and the digital networking, that's a very important things to deal with that. So you actually use this term, the digital humanization or humanism. Is that can be integrated as an artist or a digital sphere to accelerate the positive response to, like similar to what happened to COVID or any future pandemic, how you can use these skills and of course the easily distributing and shared skills and media to be able to impact positively something similar for the heritage in the future?
Yes, well, I think that, of course, we've discussed, throughout these talks, the importance of intersectionality. And, when I wrote the Techism Manifesto, it truly was a call to action for artists to get involved in, bridging the relationships and communication and dialogue with scientists, with engineers, with an interdisciplinary approach to creating culture. Because what artists are able to do is to really tap into, the culture and to create a humanistic approach to whatever the science is, whatever the technology is. For myself, I mean, I just think that as a reaction to COVID, and our reliance on the screens that we were using throughout the entire pandemic to stay in touch, to be entertained, to be healed basically through culture and through arts during that difficult time. I basically created an installation in Times Square where I basically took over the entire Times Square, 96 screens, and I created a healing installation for the public during February, during the month of February, every night at midnight. And the response has been that people want to come together, people feel more empathetic, and that using the power of art and technology or other disciplines to express what it means to be human in this day and age is very important because it helps us heal and it's good for our mental health. And of course, bringing that into the metaverse is also amazing. And as you had mentioned, education is a major component of how we're going to handle all of these global issues in the future. And I think that education in the metaverse and preservation of ideas, preservation of all kinds of, cultural legacies, language, storytelling. There's so many endangered stories and endangered languages and legacies that we need to carry forth, and they can be preserved forever in the metaverse as experiences. And these experiences in turn can also become an income revenue generating project that directly supports these communities, whether they be indigenous communities or any community. It could even be a project in Ukraine where I have supported, and many of my fellow artists in the NFT space have donated artworks to support the efforts for rebuilding Ukraine, for the communities to support displaced peoples from the war. So millions of dollars have been raised in these ways. And definitely new technology, communication, and art can definitely help in these intersections. Now, I have a wonderful.
Fantastic.
I have another. Do I have time for
Yeah,
another
I was just
question?
going to say we have maybe 1 minute for each of you to just kind of have a reflection, make a last point. So if you had a question, a quick, 1 minute answer from Ahmed, Salman, and then we could wrap up with another minute from you, Krista. Thanks.
Well, for Ahmed, I do have a question. How can arts and culture help the medical community fight skepticism using its voice and platforms?
That's a wonderful question. And I think even personally, I had this amazing experience during the COVID pandemic is really to communicate and collaborate with artists and media and really celebrities that really they have a heard voice for, of course, many people. And that's really was helping to spread the knowledge, and especially with the new or young generation, which can be more involved in digital media network and so on, and they can easily interact and communicate and fast spread knowledge, which is, of course, you need to be careful if it's correct or basically wrong knowledge or information. So it was really, really important to kind of stress on that. And it was a good start for many collaboration projects and interaction to spread knowledge, to make, of course, support to science and believing in science and getting more support to that, and even make the good examples through the public engagement with all the respect to the different fields, but not just like example, singers or players, but also heroes can be people that affecting our life directly through research or science or medicine or economy. And we need really these examples. And this is an amazing way to make that link. And I would basically switch the question to you, because I'm sure you already done a great job through the pandemic, using all the amazing skills you have through the media. And I'm sure there will be more to do. And if there's one more things now you have in your mind and you think it needs to be done in having this kind of collaboration with scientists, and of course, we'll be very glad to be involved in that. So what would be your next move or next step?
Well, I would basically like to part with a message that the metaverse can be used as a very powerful tool, not only for cultural preservation but for actual education and bringing this wonderful intersection between science and engineering that will benefit the future of humanity. I think, through, these programs that we can create, and especially with artificial intelligence, we can create mental health systems that can basically scale and offer quality care for people around the world in multiple languages. There are so many opportunities and so many programs that can be explored.
Fantastic.
I think that was fantastic. I mean, what a great exchange. Thank you so much, Krista Kim, and thank you so much, Ahmed Salman, for your ideas and your questions and your answers. So now I would like to move on to our fourth pair of thinkers, who I'm happy to introduce. We are going to hear from Jimmy Jean-Louis and Hoor Al-Qasimi. So Hoor Al-Qasimi, she is an Emirati curator, president and director of the Sharjah Art Foundation. She works to make the UAE the center of the region's art scene, as well as a hub for dialogue between East and West. Hoor Al-Qasimi is currently the chair of the board for the Sharjah Architecture Triennale, and this was also inaugurated in 2019. She was recently appointed as the president of Sharjah's new Africa Institute, which is a think tank which is really dedicated to Africa and African diaspora studies. And so, Hoor Al-Qasimi, you are going to be exchanging with Jimmy Jean-Louis. He is an award-winning Haitian actor and a human rights activist. He is the person who promotes heritage and creativity of Haiti around the world, and he is the ambassador at large for Haiti. In 2008, Jimmy Jean-Louis founded the Hollywood Unites for Haiti, which is a charity organization aiming to promote for children sportive and cultural education. And in the wake of the earthquake in 2010 in Haiti, he mobilized the actor communities and the public to raise funds for the citizens of Haiti. So we jump over to Hoor and to Jimmy. And to kick this off, I would like to pass the microphone over to Hoor Al-Qasimi, who can maybe ask the first question to Jimmy Jean-Louis. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you, Matilda and Esther, for the invitation. Well, it's been a lot to think about, listening to everybody who's been on the panel. I have to agree with Maria Fernanda Espinosa on the interpretation of heritage and what we're discussing here today. Jimmy, it's a privilege to be here speaking with you today. I have many questions, but I think we have to limit with the 20 minutes that we have. And one main one is, you're of Haitian descent, and it'll be really interesting for us to know your feelings around that heritage, being the first successful overflow of slavery in the New World, and now the poorest in the region. What does heritage mean in this context?
Well, I'm very glad to be here. First of all, thank you, UNESCO, for doing this, for having me. The question that you ask, Sheikha, this is something that I always ask myself. Being the first Black republic to fight and win the independence against the French, Napoleon Bonaparte. As a Haitian, right now, I'd like to see a bit more for that, because I believe it's a rich history, which is not enough by the mass. Haiti has a rich culture, which is not known enough by the mass. And that's why I think that there is a lot of work to do to highlight some of the historical sides, historical aspect of the country, and the wealth of cultural events and cultural and traditional richness that we have within the country. So I would definitely ask for the group, UNESCO, and whomever has some power to identify some of those cultural and values of Haiti, to really highlight them a little bit more, because unfortunately Haiti is known for being the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, as you presented it, and this is what people remember from Haiti. And as a Haitian, I can acknowledge that Haiti has problems, but at the same time, I also know, some of the great wealth that we have in Haiti, and it would be nice for those to be highlighted, whether it's through education, whether it's through, real preservation of some of those sites that we have, and make them available to the grand public, so people can be excited again to go to Haiti as they used to be excited back 50 or 60 years ago. I don't know if you know, but Haiti used to be called La Perle des Antilles, meaning by that was the key location for people for vacation, because Haiti has everything. But I don't think that in the world are knowledgeable enough about that kind of wealth that Haiti has. So that's why I believe there is a little bit of work to do when it comes to preservation of some of those cultural aspects and also historical aspect of Haiti. So a little question for you, Sheikha. I know it's been a hard time for everybody. So how did the pandemic affect your work, as a curator and heritage conversation in the United Arab Emirates? And how did you deal with the challenges?
Thank you for that, and for what you said about Haiti. It's really important for us to hear. Well, with the pandemic, for me, it was very, very important, not to disagree with some people on this panel today, but for people to come together. I refuse to put any of our exhibitions online. I'm not interested in being on another universe or visiting exhibitions in isolation. For me, what we do in culture is about bringing people together, coming together, speaking freely together without the watchful eye of Big Brother and everything being recorded. I think more and more we're being pulled apart. I noticed through homeschooling or people being educated online, children were not eager to learn anymore. There was a lot of depression. Young people were being affected by this. So I think for me, the challenges were that the whole world is suffering. Why should we rush and stick to our timeline and exhibitions? Let's postpone the biennial by 2 years. I postponed it by 2 years. Everybody thought that was crazy. But, we needed time in ourselves to catch up with the work that we've been doing. Everybody's working overtime. So let's catch up. Let's give artists time to produce the work that they need to produce. I've had artists who've lost loved ones, artists who have been homeschooling, artists, so there was a lot happening. And we're all privileged to be able to speak to each other online, but as we know, a lot of the world is not connected as well. So the world is not created equally, and we have to always think about this when we think on a global scale of what heritage is. And just to quickly say, for me, how do you interpret heritage where you have institutions that define globally what heritage should mean? And if you are part of their lists of heritage sites or not, what is heritage to one part of the world does not reflect in another, and who says how to protect it or live with it? We've had times where we've told you have to keep this as a ruin so that it could be registered as a World Heritage Site. No, but people there want to live with the space. We don't want to create spaces that are empty and only for tourists. And that's why heritage sites have struggled with the pandemic, because they're not created for people living there. They're created for tourism. So, those are the things that I've been thinking about anyway at this time.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to you with another question. With your connections, I know in West Africa, you're appearing in a lot of West African films as well. I think this shows the importance of you connecting with West African heritage and what that means to you. So it'd be good for us to see how heritage is used in terms of film industry and making it possible, to connect with the industry there and to give opportunities, with your presence.
Yeah, that's, I mean, for me, connecting with Africa is key. It's part of who I am. It's, I guess it's also a quest of identity that I'm after. When you're being displaced like that as a group of people, from one continent to another one, and having all your cultural values being limited, you sort of in a situation where you lack real identity. And connecting with the African filmmakers for me has been very personal to start with, because it's just a way to really connect with my roots. But at the same time, it's also trying to be some kind of a bridge between the West and Africa. And I understand and I see the value that there is in movies, in media, the stories that we can put out there, to conserve some of the values, the history that we have. And I think it's key to start having real African content that can preserve some of our history. And I'm very keen to continuing to collaborate with African filmmakers, and hopefully, we'll find the means to do some of the projects that we want to do, because as you must know, it's very difficult to get any real projects done if it's done with in Africa, by Africans, for Africans. It's very difficult to get the funds. And when I say for Africans, it's sort of speak. When you put a project out there, it is for everybody. But at the same time, for, by, with Africans, this is something that's still very, very challenging in the business in which I am. So yeah, there is great value to that, and I will continue to connect. I will continue to understand our values. I will continue to travel. Talking about traveling, by going to Egypt, going to Jordan, I see the work that is done in those countries to preserve their values, whether it's Luxor, whether it's Petra, whether it's Wuran, and all those places just inspire me as a person, as an actor, as a Haitian, to maybe see some of my national sites being visited by millions, as I saw in those countries. And how could I potentially show some of those sites on movies, so people can be aware of them and might eventually want to go and travel to Haiti to take a look, and then discover Haiti for what Haiti is, the spirit of Haiti, the culture of Haiti, the perseverance of the people. They always say that Haitians are resilient, Well, I guess because of history, from our independence to, all the political issues that we've had, to natural disasters. Yeah, we're creating a group that is extremely resilient, and talking about disease, talking about COVID-19. Yes, we've had everything from cholera, AIDS, to now, of course, COVID-19. So, it's a group of people that has been affected by very heavy situations, and that does create resilience. And I'd like to show, some of that spirit that we have in our people, via movies. And I hope, that we can continue, being seen as people, as human as well, and getting the help that we want by potentially groups like UNESCO to continue highlighting the positive things of Haiti. So let me send you back a little question as well. How can cultural and natural heritage in the region that you are increase the resilience and maybe the preparedness of communities against potential new crises?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to a little bit to my introduction, because it was mentioned that the Africa Institute was founded recently, but the story is bigger than that. It was initially set up as Africa Hall in 1976, which was a hall that came into place called Africa Hall, and its background was the first conference that took place there was a conference on African Arab relations. So it was a movement of Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism that connected. And I think this is something that was very much part of my father's generation as he founded that. And 40 years later, it was something that I felt was important to bring back and to continue, but in a way of calling it an Institute for African Diaspora Studies, so the Africa Institute. And it continues the work that we also do at Sharjah Art Foundation as a biennial. You know, we were biennial before we're institution. We had a program before we have a space. And it's not about connecting East to West, it's about connecting the Global South, us in the Global South, speaking to each other about our own stories and having our own platform. So I don't know if you can hear me, my camera's frozen.
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you perfectly.
Great. Sorry. So for me, that was really important, you know, to continue. And culture has that space, you know, where we can do this, and we continue to do this through collaboration. And I would love to, talk more about, you know, African cinema as well, and what can be done on that platform at a different time, for sure.
Definitely, we'll take it away, you know, separately and discuss and see how we can potentially come together on some common ideas and move those ideas forward.
So Noor, I was going to ask Hoor a bit more about this question about the resilience and in the region, taking a bit from what Jimmy was saying about resilience for Haiti and the resilience issue that he posed to you. How are you finding that in this heritage in the post-COVID era? Where is the resilience coming from for your region?
I think, you know, when you define region, it's very problematic, because for me, the way I define region is by the people who live in that area. So we always say we're the Menasa region, but, you know, we always include people from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, people who live in the country. You know, the UAE is very multicultural. So the word region is always, I always try to redefine that with the works that we do, with the projects that we work on. I think, you know, talking about COVID, you know, there were strict rules at the very beginning. Things opened up. You know, we didn't have people who were opposed to, you know, wearing masks and following those rules. So I think in that way we were fine. But it was really more about care, you know, the importance of care you have to each other. And for me, running an institution, my number one was, I don't want anybody to lose their jobs. I want everyone to have their health care. I want to make sure people are not under a lot of pressure and stress. You know, like as someone who's running an organization, your number one priority are the people that work with you. And I think, you know, it's not about resilience, I guess, it's about care. And human interaction. I can't stress that enough. You know, like the way speaking to each other here is not the same as if we were in a round table speaking to each other in a room. I'm you know, communicating and available on all these platforms, and it's great that people can watch everywhere. But I stress the importance of, you know, being in person with each other.
Yeah, I agree.
We have about a minute left. So Jimmy, what are your last thoughts? Heritage post-COVID.
I mean, I was just agreeing with her, because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a people's person. I like the connection. I like to be close to people, and you know, I'm coping with the situation, but it's a little bit more difficult. And I'll go back to a point that Dr. Salim said. In South Africa, of course, we have Ubuntu, and in Haiti, we have l'union fait la force, you know, meaning by that, you know, unity makes strength. And I'm very much for that, and I'm so encouraged by what I'm seeing by this panel here, and hopefully we'll continue to push our ideas further and always put the people first.
Excellent, excellent. Wow. Well, two different perspectives, but a lot of the same values and thoughts and priority for putting people first. So thank you so much to both of you, Hoor Al-Qasimi and Jimmy Jean-Louis, for this interesting exchange. And now here we are at the last of our dialogues. So we're on our fifth and last one, and I'm really pleased now to introduce two more great thinkers, Rana Dajani and Zoe Butt. So Rana is a Palestinian Jordanian molecular biologist specialized in molecular cell biology, epigenetics, and biomarkers of trauma. Turn my page. Among refugees. She is also interested in raising the health, educational, and social status of women and children in her region. And Rana also is very focused on education for children and women. She established We Love Reading, an organization to foster a passion for reading among children. And she organized 3 circles of Alimat, a mentoring and networking program for women academics. And she's going to, she also has a career with many accolades worldwide. And most recently, she was the recipient of the Schwab Award for Social Entrepreneurship in 2022. And she's going to be discussing with Ms. Zoe Butt, who is a curator and a writer based in Vietnam and Thailand, with over 2 decades of international experience across public and private sectors in the arts. She is a MoMA International Curatorial Fellow, member of Asia Society's Asia 21 Initiative, and a member of the Asia Art Council for the Salman Guggenheim Museum. So Zoe Butt, she has also been named as a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2013. So ladies, I'm happy to turn the microphone over first, I think, to Rana Dajani, who could start with the first question that she could pose to Zoe Butt. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Assalamu alaikum, which in Arabic means peace upon you all. It's really a privilege to be here, hopefully representing many of the voices on the ground about how are we going to go forward in the next 50 years for reshaping the world. And I really applaud UNESCO for inviting such a diverse group of people to represent the world, to discuss these issues, not just in terms of geography and ethnicity, but also in terms of sector and discipline. So Zoe, and this exchange between us, we come from very different sectors, is where, you know, innovation happens at the boundaries of different sectors, so that we can solve together the challenges that we're facing through heritage and culture and science. So in from your perspective, Zoe, how was culture and heritage impacted by the pandemic in Vietnam and Southeast Asia in general? And do you think there will be a long-term effect of that?
Thanks, Rana. I actually think we have more in common than what my bio will say, which is always the dilemma with bios. They give you a glimpse into what is only a fraction of what you actually care about. But in terms of your question, I think that during the last 3 years, we've seen heritage say a big thank you because of COVID. It didn't have tourists trampling its feet all over rather disrespectfully with very little knowledge of what context brought forth these natural wonders, be they built or be they actually natural. When it comes to intangible forms of heritage, I think we'd all agree that globally we were relying on many forms of cultural ritual, be they singing, oral histories, be they certain forms of cuisine, be they ghost stories, in order to embrace the amount of time that we all seemed to have suddenly on our plate that took us away from the formulas of our 21st century, rather overly dominated neoliberal worlds. So I think that what was the impact of the pandemic? I think it made us majoritively stop to think about how much we need these cultural forms of expression in ways that we perhaps hadn't quite valued them enough before. So in terms of its long-term effect, I sincerely hope that, and we can see this globally when we're talking about our reassessment of where we work, how we work, for who we work, this question of labor in relationship to the consciousness that we have about where we've come from. And I think in that note, you and I do share a lot in one respect, which is a responsibility to serve community. And from what I can glean from the projects you've done, such as We Love Reading and Three Circle of Alamat, is something that's very central to my own practice, which is mentoring and really understanding the importance of dialogue in nurturing a historical consciousness, in giving agency to, for me, it's not just women. I know that a lot of your work focuses on women, but I guess as a fellow writer and a lover of literature myself, who comes from a place of privilege when it comes to my education, and I've chosen to spend the last 15 years in Vietnam, now Thailand, where the art of reading and endeavoring to spend hours in this kind of cultural consciousness isn't practiced. So how do you feel this idea of literature can link an appreciation to heritage? Do you feel that the written words that are circulating about heritage, for a built heritage, do they give enough contextual background to its importance?
You are speaking to my heart. So We Love Reading is all about storytelling. And as a biologist, I believe that as humans were evolving, you had two groups of people, one that sat around the fire and told stories, and the other one that said, are you wasting your time? And we can imagine together which was the group that survived. It was the storytellers. So storytelling is fundamental to our survival as a species. And therefore, when we tell stories, whether it's in the oral form or the written form, we are transferring knowledge across generations. And this knowledge constitutes wisdom, best practices, values and ethics, all that are what constitute heritage. And if we look at who is usually telling the stories, they are the mothers. And also going back to biology and evolution, it is the female that evolved to have a uterus and to nurse, being we are mammalian species. And so it is through that extended childhood experience that is unique to humans. And one poses the question, so how can we have this long extended childhood? And it is to transfer that social heritage, that social evolution that we require, so that the next generation can take from that knowledge to navigate the social landscape on one hand between fellow human beings, but also to navigate the earth around us and biodiversity and nature, how to be good guardians of nature, to keep the balance and harmony of nature and not destroy it as what's happening today. So to me, storytelling is a science in itself. And we need to promote creating that story, right? And when you talk about literature, we're talking about, when you're reading a story, you're talking about using the language. And when I talk about language, we're talking about the local language, the native language, the one that we nurse on, that we breastfeed on. It is that language. And here there's something that we need to be wary of, which is with universality and globalization, and some languages are dominating more than others. And this is part of the heritage that we need to maintain, because if every individual is not expressing themselves in the language that they grow up on, we will be losing a lot of heritage from the thoughts and the imagination from different populations around the world. Hence, We Love Reading also focuses on speaking, reading in your native tongue, capturing those stories again. And that leads, by the way, to maintaining identity and feeling proud where you come from, and not feeling that you are less. And again, how do we break that power dynamics that came as a result of economic colonization and all that? So language is a powerful tool that can be used either way. And I think during COVID, what we have seen is when families stayed at home, communities, yes, they were disconnected from the world and maybe from work, which are imposed structures. The evolutionary social structures remained within the family unit, not just the individual. Again, that's something that came from modernity. But going back to the local community, we see people coming back together helping each other, working together, and telling the stories, which, by the way, gave us a boost for building resilience. Because when you are sitting with a human rather than on going to another place, leaving your home, leaving your family, I know there are pros and cons to that. But if we look at communities where family has been very central, we see the pros coming out of staying at home, listening to my children, learning about them, hearing their stories, settling down. I like to call it the global retreat. In Arabic, we have a word, i'tikaf, where we have a time to reflect, to think through other things, and to relish what is important in life, which is those human interactions. And as we tell the stories, this is an encouragement that every story matters and every story counts, because there's so many stereotypes around the world driven by media for different reasons and different agendas. And hence the onus is on us to write our stories, to share it with the world. We owe it not just to ourselves, but to future generation, that nobody else writes our narrative, but we write it. And that way we change the narrative, which is heritage, because stereotypes will shape the memories, which shapes heritage. And so how do we recapture that? We urge everyone to write their story and not to belittle their story. They count. From a biologist's point of view, nobody's DNA is like anyone else. And so everyone is unique and has something to contribute, which actually leads me to another question, Zoe, for you. Since you're an accomplished curator, and art always intrigues me, right? And I know that art and science are all connected together, and this siloing of modernity doesn't make sense. And we know that we need to break those and work together. So in your opinion, how can contemporary art serve to protect and promote heritage? And has that relationship between contemporary art and heritage been impacted by COVID-19?
I couldn't agree more with you when it comes to how storytelling is a very powerful vehicle through which we hold our DNA. It's not only in how we tell the story, but I believe it's important where we tell the story and to whom we are sharing it to. And for me, artists are incredible storytellers because they use images and certain materials that remind us of where we are today. They might use technology, they might use the latest cooking ingredient, they might use the latest hipster form of music. And those forms of materials are of the 21st century, and they're talking back to something that too much of the world wants to put in a time period that says that's in the past. That's a tradition that we want to lock into a certain kind of era that's predated where we are today. And so that's where I find art in general, but particularly contemporary art, gives pause for reflection. And I think we have to all remind ourselves that COVID-19 and the pandemic served to unfortunately elide certain other social disasters. During that time, Southeast Asia had the Myanmar military coup. We had Afghanistan again taken by the Taliban. We had some really hideous mass collective consciousness impacted by these political movements, to which COVID was not and could not be their first concern. It was survival, and indeed it was intangible forms of heritage that sustained their sense of who they are under that form of duress and trauma. So I think how the relationship between contemporary art and heritage has been impacted, I would say from what I can see in the contemporary art world today, there are an increasing number of artists who understand the power of their voice to give context to the stories that we just see as image in our overly image saturated world today. I think it's important we have more stories circulating the occurrences, the facts and the figures that we're given, and that those stories are not just in written, but they're sensorially experienced. And I couldn't agree more with Hoor in saying that we must continue to prioritize the meeting of the flesh, because that is where our stories really do take root. I wanted to also talk a little bit about where the diaspora plays out in your work, and to what extent the imagination of the diaspora feeds into your concepts of heritage. Do you think that this has been impacted by COVID-19 at all?
So absolutely. So diaspora in the widest context, meaning of that word, whether we're talking about diaspora in terms of profession or diaspora in terms of other reasons that have, let's say, made people move and circulate. And we're all, by the way, diaspora. We all come from, some place where humans originated in Africa and somewhere on the continent. So in a way, we're all diaspora across time. So again, we can speak of that long heritage, but maybe more so to speak about my field, which are scientists in diaspora across the world. We are actually holding a summit, a global summit on science and diaspora. How can we harness that potential? We talk of brain drain, but I want to talk about brain circulation. How can we harness that power? Because we know many people who are living in diaspora want to give back. And it's not just diaspora from south going to the north, but it's also south-south, as mentioned earlier. How do we make that healthy circulation of knowledge, experience, and expertise? Because these people who have been to diaspora, or part of the diaspora, actually are the bridges, right, of understanding and exchange, because they understand both cultures, and therefore they are better at translating context, because many times we have things that are lost in translation. So how do you maintain a healthy balance between sharing the heritage without overriding it, right, and erasing it, not intentionally, of course. We won't talk about the intentional. So how do you do that? And I think it's about having a mindset that this is a two-way thing. This is about mutual exchange. It's about respect, and it's about trust, which it has to be fostered, and we foster it through dialogue, through conversations, through having a mindset of I can learn from you. So even to pay attention to terminology. So as we describe heritage, what are the terms we use? What is the jargon we use? So it's not about capacity building, it's about sharing, it's about learning, it's about so to be very careful on the words we choose, because heritage is formed by words which are formed by thoughts. So I think one of the lessons that I would like to share going forward, because this dialogue is not just about reflecting on the past, but actually trying to draw paths going forward of how this will look like. So I want to talk about, as we exchange a south to south or more mutual, let's say, power dynamics all over the world, what COVID has showed us is that everyone counts and everyone's important. And there's so much to learn from other cultures, whether we're talking about, as was mentioned earlier, best practices and habits that have been ancient, like wearing the mask or staying in a quarantine, which is part of the Islamic civilization in the past, or mental health and practices of mental health, respecting the local, and maybe even exporting ideas, not just north-south, but south-north and all over the world. What we've learned from our research, that there's not one story for the world, there's multiple stories. So with COVID, what we hear in the media are all the negative stories, because negative is sensational. How do we promote the positive so that that becomes the narrative and gives hope and builds resilience and reduces stress and anxiety? Tell those stories, have a pen and talk about them and share them in different ways. And I think we have been able to do this through COVID. One, because of technology. So it's achieving that balance between human and technology. Because of Zoom, scientists can talk to each other across the world. Suddenly, we see ourselves as scientists, even if we come from other parts of the world, relevant, important, because viruses don't know a barrier. And we will not be safe unless the last person is safe anywhere in the world. So this has been a humbling experience for some and an empowering experience for others. So connecting on Zoom has been a great way to level that playing field. And we need it, because we need everyone to do better science and to do better service for humanity. And it can no longer be done in isolation. And people are realizing that more and more, how important it is to have that open, equal dialogue with trust and respect. So I have a question for you. Springing from the South-South cooperation, how and why is this important to respond to the global crisis for you, coming from your background? And how can you imagine it impacting the next 50 years of heritage?
South-South work and thinking has been a major part of my imagination for nearly 2 decades, because I experienced firsthand young people who assume a dream in the global north. And it's in a context that has an ecology, it has funding, it has access, it has knowledge set up in certain formulas that they think they can just slot themselves into. They finish their education and they come back home and the landscape is rather different. And that experience became, in many cases, I witnessed something that made them quit, at least in the arts when it comes to the humanities. So I started to think about how, form of cultural life come from the exchange of trade, the exchange of ideas, much more deep-rooted across the axis because of the French occupation, the French Empire. So when we start to map our relationships that go against the mainstream imaging of us, we start to see solutions to our own dilemmas in different places. And so we start to hear different stories, we start to hear different terminologies being used, which then gives agency and then gives alternative and then gives a differing imagination. So for me, the South to South dialogues are incredibly crucial in all forms of life. We're starting to understand how we can give ourselves different pictures to move forward, different pictures of heritage that aren't labored under some kind of monotheistic or dynastic culture, but instead gives way for the indigenous, the small animistic, the shamanistic practices. And I think that there's some wonderful things to learn scientifically. Even the cosmological worlds of the South to South dialogue set up some really amazing relationships between materials, for example. But I'm not sure if we've gone over time or.
Yeah, hi. Really, it's been so interesting. I hate to jump in and stop this really great exchange, the great questions and the reflections. But I have to say at this moment, we've just finished our last of the dialogue. So thank you so much to Rana Dajani and so many thanks to you as well, Zoe Butt. And thanks to all of our panelists. My gosh, what a really rich, interesting series of exchanges, so many ideas, so many common ideas and so many proposals for the future and for things for UNESCO to take back and reflect on. So we're at the end of our third 50 Minds for the Next 50. I would like to invite everyone back to our next session of 50 Minds for the Next 50, which is on the 20th of June, and it's going to be dedicated to sustainable tourism and heritage. And at this point, I want to invite back UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Culture, Ernesto Ottone, who's going to give us a few last-minute thoughts, a bit of a wrap-up of today's great exchange. So over to you, Ernesto Ottone, and thanks again to everyone. I hope Ernesto is able to connect because I don't see him yet, but let's hang on for just 30 seconds. Here we are.
You cannot start your video. Je suis coupé. Rochelle. Hi. Do you hear me, Rochelle?
I can hear you, Ernesto.
I don't have video. I've been cut off from now.
Well, in fact, we can hear you. There you are. All right, over to you. Thanks.
So, well, as everybody have been following us, that has been our third meeting, debate, dialogue around one of the most important subjects that we all lived. It was really a great pleasure to see how we are able to discuss between the importance of heritage right now and what we have been enduring during these last 2 years, and how different perspectives can get together to reflect on what should be our reflection, our vision, and also what are in stake with our heritage, natural but also cultural heritage, and how we are capable with a global vision from all around the world, with expertise that are coming from many different side to build on this moment and to try to get in touch more with the nature, but at the same time with the support of a reflection that goes beyond the traditional knowledge on heritage done by experts. So thank you all for this rich and thought-provoking session. Over the last 2 hours, we have discussed the opportunities, threats, and limitation of digital transformation for natural and cultural heritage. I will mention some of the quotes that we summarized. Frank Snowden made a connection between culture, science, and experience during the pandemic and urged us to preserve these collective memories. He said, and I quote, "We need a global ministry of innovative ideas with regard to heritage. By leveraging its relationship to health, we could avoid another pandemic experience." Adi Utarini reminded us the power of the interdisciplinary approach between health and culture. Potential is enormous. We can trigger strategic area in heritage and health. It can attract many researchers from different expertise to come together. My dear friend Maria Fernanda Espinosa emphasized that indigenous people possess rich and diverse heritage and culture. COVID-19 divided the society, but indigenous knowledge can be used in the traditional governance system. Their knowledge must be employed to deal with the pandemic and other issues. Ahmed Salman shared his thoughts on how important culture is in reducing these inequalities. To leverage the power of culture, storytelling, and communication to disseminate accurate, life-saving. Krista Kim raised how this. She drew our attention to the potential of the metaverse for cultural preservation, education, and mental well-being. Echoing the power of screens, which many of us around the world experienced during the pandemic, Jimmy Jean-Louis told us that screen media can be a powerful way to conserve history and heritage. It allows audiences to access their cultural identities and learn about other heritage and culture, even in the middle of crisis. As Rana Dajani perfectly summarized, innovation happens at the boundaries of different sectors, so we can solve the challenges we are facing in heritage, culture, and science. This third session of the 50 Minds for the next 50 is part of an ongoing reflection process. For those of you listening from around the world, I would like to invite you to continue following our interdisciplinary dialogues in the coming weeks. And also, if you want other people to reach UNESCO and to follow all the dialogue that we have been in the last weeks, it will be put online up to tomorrow, so that you can also share the information through our webpage. We will be welcoming more luminaries to discuss the following key areas: sustainable tourism and balanced representation of heritage. I would like to finish by the words of Salim Abdool Karim, who said, "In Africa, we live by the word Ubuntu. It means I am because you are. I exist not as an island and not in a vacuum. I exist because you exist." The next 15 must be led by the spirit of Ubuntu, where we care for each other and each other's heritage. A thought for all the wars where people are struggling right now, that goes completely against what we are trying to achieve by these dialogues. Thank you very much for the fantastic thinkers that we had today, and see you on the 20th June. Thank you so much. Bye.